So it looks like the stream is definitely going. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to run through, I'll just run through the basics of just getting started in Maya, and I'll try and do it really quickly. And if you want, you can sort of go back through it, and usually this is sort of a two-parter, so I'll stop at some point and do a second part of this. And so to start now, let's just go through with sort of the basics of the interface. So up here you have your tools. You'll have this drop down where you can switch between different aspects of modeling. So the basic ones that we usually use are animation or polygons, dynamics and rendering. We'll get into later, but if you're doing game art in general, unless you're doing animation, you're probably under polygons. So you want to make sure you get that sort of drop down to start. That's going to then give us access to a lot of tools that we'll need later on. Here we have our shelf. Later on, I'll sort of go on how to add some stuff to your shelf. This is sort of hotkeys and things you can add to make modeling in your life easier. On the right, you have your channel box. This will give you a lot of extra options for things. We'll sort of go over that in more detail later. We'll keep referencing this. And here we have like some layers that you can use as Photoshop layers, good for making things visible. Over here you have your basic, on the left side here you have your basic keys. Some of these I still like to use from time to time, like the lasso tool or the paint selection tool. But the big thing with this, because a lot of this is your move, rotate, and scale. So if we have a cube here, you can move, rotate, and scale this cube. This is all sort of done. We don't really use this left bar here. You want to have your left hand on the keyboard. So at all times you want your left hand to be on the left side of the keyboard. You're going to be using a lot of the QWERTY keys, Q, W, E, R, are going to be our main keys, and sometimes we'll be using Alt and Control and Shift. Your right hand is going to be on your mouse. And just before we start getting into the navigation of the viewport and everything, I'll just mention down here, these are access to a lot of our different viewports. Okay, so let's talk about sort of navigating. So to start, if I create under Polygon Primitives, we'll just create a basic cube. I have my scale set to something around UDK, so I am going to just scale this cube up. So in order for me to navigate around this cube, I have my left hand on my keyboard. If I hold down Alt, I like to hold it down with my thumb, and then I left click, I can then rotate around the cube. If I hold Alt and my middle mouse button, middle mouse button on the mouse with Alt, I can pan. So Alt and left click, rotate. I can go in all angles and directions. Middle mouse button, I can pan. Alt and right click will let me zoom in and zoom out. You can also use the mouse wheel. So those are sort of the basic movement functions to moving around your object. So we have Alt and left click, Alt and middle mouse, Alt and right click. Now if we hit space bar, what that will do is it'll open up some other views for us. These are orthographic views, and if we look closer we can see top, front, and side. These are really helpful for lining some stuff up. We'll sort of see how we use these a little bit later on when we get into it. But they're very helpful for just navigating in 3D space, especially when you're starting, so you can see where things are. So you can see, like, in your top-down view here where some stuff is at. And the way we can sort of get in and out of these views is if I click inside of this viewport here, I can then hit spacebar to maximize that, and spacebar to minimize that. Just click in another one, spacebar, spacebar, and while inside of these, I still have control of Alt and middle mouse button to pan if I want. And I could also do Alt and right click to zoom in, zoom out. I'm going to click inside of here, spacebar, and I'm going to zoom in, zoom out of here. Okay, so that's sort of our basic navigation. And I'll just sort of point out sort of quickly, if I click on this cube, I mentioned the channel box before. This is going to give us just some basic information about our cube. It's going to give us a little history on the cube and when we created it. We can use some of this stuff later on to modify the cube if we wanted to. This is usually helpful for things like a cylinder. If we wanted to, we could determine how many edges around we want it to be, things like that. It also shows us the scale, so we can see how much I scaled it up, and it'll show us where I have it just in the 3D world. We'll keep referring to this, but this is just a little FYI, some helpful information that we have right there. So now that we know a little bit about just navigating the viewport, we want to know about how to sort of manipulate some of these objects a little bit. And I've sort of done some of this already. Have we seen me scale this stuff? So what we have is we have Q, W, E, and R, and they go selection, which is Q, W is move, E is rotate, and R is scale. It's a little tricky because you might think you might think R would be rotate, but it's not. R is scale. So I'll just run through that a couple more times. We have Q is selection, W is move, E is rotate, and R is scale. And your first inclination when you're starting to use this program might be to go over here to some of these buttons here and use them to access these widgets or gidgets or manipulators, however you want to call them. But if you're going to get really good at this program, you want to make sure that you're using W, E, and R. You want to have that left hand on the keyboard at all times, because then you can really you can just move and manipulate things really quickly, and you're not constantly pressing another button. So it's essential to have that left hand on the keyboard, switching between your tools and your move tool, your rotate tool, and your scale tool. So that's really clutch, and it's going to be definitely a difficult learning curve. It's not going to be easy, but the less that you fight it and just sort of agree that it has to happen, the easier this goes, the faster it goes, and you'll just have a much easier time, and things will start to go quicker and easier for you. And yes, and that's sort of the biggest learning curve. Once you get sort of through the first two parts of sort of learning Maya, which is maybe like at most, let's say like 2 to 3 hours. I'm sort of running through this fairly quickly, so it could be, we'll see if we can get it down to like an hour. But once you sort of get through the navigation and understanding that, and manipulating objects as you want to, the rest sort of falls in line and becomes easier. The rest is just sort of adding on to what we already know, but the major concepts, the sort of difficult 3D concepts, become a lot easier at that point. So now that we sort of have some of those basic, let's talk about just the widgets, these manipulators in general. so that we make sure that we understand how they're working. So, and what I mean is this manipulator itself. I'll scale it up there so we can see. So if we click on the arrow, and notice the different color arrows correspond to some of our different axes in the world. So Y here is up, and we can see that Y here is green, and that'll go up. Blue, and then we have red for X. If I pull on this arrow, it will pull in that direction for me, and I'm just sliding my mouse back and forth now. If I click in the middle of that manipulator, it allows me to go in 360 degrees, or I shouldn't say 360, it allows me to go in 2 axes with that manipulator. So I'm not just moving in one direction anymore, I'm moving in both. Typically, this is sort of just a tip, typically I don't move this in 2 axes in my perspective view, but I may do that in my orthographic view. In my orthographic view, I can sort of know, like say from my top down, I know where this is moving this in my 3D world. If you're moving this in 2 axes in your perspective view, it's very easy to lose the depth of where you're moving a cube, and you can sort of, things get tricky and a little confusing. We'll sort of see this. We'll come to an exercise towards the end of this for you to try out, and sort of like a amateur or let's say like rookie or beginner thing to do is to move this middle manipulator in your perspective view when you're starting out, and you kind of want to. I only tend to do it in my orthographic views because it's more predictable that way. It's very unpredictable somewhat, unless you're making sort of small movements and you sort of know what you're doing. But it will move it in 2 axes. So if we go to rotate, which is E, I'll hit spacebar to zoom in here. If I click and roll on one of these axes, I can start to rotate in that direction. So we can rotate objects this way. And so it's like if I grab this yellow one, that'll give us the 2 axes that we sort of had with the move manipulator. If we hit R for scale, same things apply, so I can scale this in one direction. Or if I hit the middle part of that manipulator, the blue, which is now yellow, I can universally scale this. Okay, so those are sort of the, that's sort of some of the basics of manipulating the world, or moving around the world, and creating objects and whatnot. So if we want to go, so I think a good exercise to try now is creating a snowman. So I'll just go through, I'll create the snowman, and what I'll do is I'll repeat a lot of the commands that I'm using and what I'm doing, so we can sort of try and cement some of the stuff that we went over in going through this now. So I'm going to go into create here, and under create we're going to use Polygon Primitives. I didn't really go over what some of these are, but for now, for the most part, what you're almost always going to use to start off is Polygon Primitives, and these are just different 3D shapes. So if we're going to make a snowman, we have a lot of different shapes here to start with. We'll just go with a sphere to start. So in creating the base of this, first thing I need to do is hit R to scale that up, get that a little bit bigger. These 2 black lines indicate my origin point. That's my 0, 0 point. If we look over here on the channel box on the right, and I want this sphere to sit above that. I want this horizontal axis line to act as my ground plane. So I'm just going to pull this up here. If we wanted to, we'd get some maybe a little bit advanced stuff. I could move my manipulator and just drag that down. But that's just sort of a preview. We'll come back to that later. So say we have a sphere there. We'll create another sphere. I'm hitting W